The workshop hummed with the steady rhythm of clinking tools and the low murmur of conversation. Dust motes floated in the golden light, streaming through the windows, settling on wooden benches cluttered with gears, screws, and half-finished timepieces. For Jacob Ellis, this workshop was both a place of passion and a quiet battlefield. As the only black craftsman in the small-town clock repair shop, Jacob often felt like an outsider. The other workers didn't outright insult him. No, their prejudice was quieter, more insidious. They rarely acknowledged him unless necessary, and when they did, it was with curt words or dismissive glances. Lunchtime was the worst, as they gathered at one end of the break room, sharing jokes and stories, leaving Jacob to eat in silence at the other. Jacob, however, refused to let their behaviour dampen his pride in his work. He had always been fascinated by the intricate mechanics of clocks, the way each tiny gear and spring played a role in creating something that measured time itself. He often lost himself in the delicate art of repair, finding solace in the precision and care it required. One Monday morning, the door to the workshop slammed open, jolting everyone from their tasks. In strode Henry Cooper, a burly man with a reputation for his temper and his unyielding disdain for Jacob. Henry carried an old wooden clock in his hands, its varnish worn and its glass face cracked. "Who do I talk to about fixing this?" Henry barked, looking around the room. Jacob glanced up from his bench but said nothing. One of the other craftsmen, an older man named Arthur, gestured lazily toward Jacob. "Ask Ellis," he said with a smirk. "He's good with the fiddly stuff." Henry's eyes narrowed as he turned to Jacob. "You fix clocks, right?" Jacob nodded, keeping his tone professional. "Yes, I do. What seems to be the problem?" Henry hesitated, then stepped forward, placing the clock on Jacob's workbench with a thud. "This belonged to my father. It hasn't worked in years. Can you fix it?" Jacob studied the clock carefully. It was a mantelpiece timepiece, its ornate design suggesting it was at least a century old. Beneath the wear and grime, he could see the craftsmanship of a bygone era. It was a beautiful piece, and something about it intrigued him. "I can take a look," Jacob said, "but it'll take time. The internal mechanisms might need extensive repairs." Henry crossed his arms, his tone brusque. "Just do what you can." As Henry turned to leave, Jacob called after him. "If you don't mind me asking, why now? Why fix it after all these years?" Henry paused, his back to Jacob. "It's important," he said gruffly, before walking out the door. That afternoon, as Jacob carefully disassembled the clock, he couldn't help but wonder about Henry's attachment to it. Beneath the layers of dust and rust, the mechanisms were corroded but salvageable. It was a challenge, but Jacob relished the opportunity to restore something so intricate. At lunch, the other craftsmen whispered among themselves, occasionally shooting glances at Jacob's bench. He ignored them, focusing instead on cleaning the delicate gears and springs. But he couldn't ignore the subtle weight of their judgment, or the way they seemed to find humour in the idea of him helping Henry Cooper. "He's wasting his time," one of them muttered, loud enough for Jacob to hear. Jacob kept his head down, refusing to rise to the bait. The clock would speak for itself. The following days found Jacob engrossed in the clock's intricate workings. Each rusted gear and tarnished spring told a story, and as he carefully cleaned and reassembled the mechanism, he couldn't help but feel a sense of connection to the piece. It wasn't just a clock. It was a symbol of something deeper, though he couldn't yet say what. Late one afternoon, as Jacob adjusted the final spring, the workshop door creaked open. Henry Cooper stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. The other craftsmen glanced up briefly before returning to their work, but Jacob straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Cooper," Jacob said, gesturing toward the clock on his bench. "I was just about to test it." Henry approached, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The clock looked completely transformed. The wood gleamed with a fresh polish, the glass face replaced, and the brass hands restored to their original luster. "Looks nice," Henry admitted grudgingly. "But does it work?" Jacob nodded, winding the key carefully. The clock emitted a low click as its gears began to turn. Moments later, the pendulum swung into motion, and a steady, rhythmic ticking filled the air. Henry stared, his mouth slightly open. "I didn't think it could be fixed," he said quietly. "I thought it was too far gone." "Most things can be fixed," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "If you're willing to put in the work." Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he ran his hand over the smooth wood, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings. "This clock was my father's," he said after a moment, his voice softer than Jacob had ever heard it. "He used to wind it every Sunday morning, without fail. After he passed, I tried to fix it myself, but I didn't know how." Jacob studied Henry's face, noticing the vulnerability hidden beneath his gruff exterior. "It's not easy to work on something that means so much," he said gently, "but I'm glad you brought it in." Henry nodded, his gaze still fixed on the clock. "I didn't think you'd take it. Figured you'd say no." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Why would I say no? It's my job to fix clocks." Henry shifted uncomfortably, his hands in his pockets. "Because, well, I haven't exactly been kind to you." Jacob leaned back, folding his arms. "No, you haven't." The blunt honesty caught Henry off guard. He looked up, meeting Jacob's steady gaze. "I was wrong," Henry said finally, his voice filled with a raw sincerity. "About a lot of things. You didn't deserve the way I treated you." Jacob nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling between them. "It takes courage to admit that." Henry smiled faintly. "And it takes patience to put up with someone like me. Thank you for fixing the clock and for giving me the chance to make things right." Over the weeks that followed, something shifted in the workshop. Henry began stopping by Jacob's bench, not to criticize or dismiss, but to ask questions. He showed a genuine interest in Jacob's work, often marveling at his skill and attention to detail. The other craftsmen noticed the change too. Their quiet whispers and judgmental glances gradually gave way to curiosity and respect. One by one, they began to approach Jacob with questions of their own, seeking his expertise and acknowledging his talent. One day, during a rare lull in the workshop, Henry pulled up a stool beside Jacob. "You ever think about opening your own place?" he asked, his tone conversational. Jacob glanced at him, surprised. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but it's not easy. Starting a business takes resources I don't have." Henry rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You've got the skill. And if you ever need help, well, I know people. Just say the word." The offer took Jacob aback. Coming from the man who had once treated him with such disdain, it felt like a testament to how far they had come. "I'll keep that in mind," Jacob said, a small smile tugging at his lips. The clock repair became a talking point in the workshop, a symbol of transformation that extended beyond the timepiece itself. When Henry brought the clock back to his family, he shared the story of its restoration, emphasizing Jacob's skill and professionalism. Word spread quickly, and soon Jacob found himself with more requests than he could handle. One evening, as he closed up shop, Jacob found a small package on his workbench. Inside was a brand new set of precision tools, along with a note. "To the best craftsman I know, thanks for everything. Henry." Jacob smiled, running his fingers over the polished steel. He knew the tools weren't just a gift, they were a gesture of respect, a way for Henry to show his gratitude. By the end of the year, the atmosphere in the workshop had transformed. Where once there had been silence and distance, there was now camaraderie and collaboration. The other craftsmen began inviting Jacob to join them for lunch, seeking his advice on their projects, and even sharing laughs over the occasional mistake. But the most unexpected change was his friendship with Henry. What had started as a tense, begrudging interaction had blossomed into a genuine connection. They often stayed late after work, sharing stories about their lives and dreams over cups of coffee. One evening, as they watched the hands of a freshly repaired clock tick forward, Henry turned to Jacob with a thoughtful expression. "You know, this clock taught me something," he said. "What's that?" Jacob asked. That time doesn't fix things, Henry replied. People do. Jacob nodded, the truth of Henry's words settling deep in his chest. You're right, but it takes more than just fixing. It takes effort, patience, and understanding. And a good friend, Henry added, smiling. Jacob chuckled, extending his hand. A good friend helps too. They shook hands, the sound of the clock's steady ticking a reminder of how far they'd both come. The courtroom was quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of attorneys preparing for the case to begin. David Carter adjusted his tie, trying to steady his nerves. As one of the few black attorneys in the city, he had grown used to standing out in spaces like this, but today the weight of expectation felt heavier than usual. David was representing a young man named Marcus Fields, who had been wrongfully accused of burglary. The evidence against Marcus was flimsy at best. A single eyewitness who had seen a figure running from the scene at night and claimed it was him. Marcus had an alibi, but David knew all too well how little that mattered in a city where systemic racism often dictated the outcomes of trials. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Frank Whitaker, was known for his harsh tactics and his ability to sway predominantly white juries. As the trial began, David presented a meticulous case, highlighting the inconsistencies in the witness's testimony and providing evidence of Marcus's whereabouts at the time of the crime. But with every objection from Whitaker that was sustained and every skeptical glance from the jury, David felt the scales of justice tipping against him. The turning point came during the prosecutor's closing arguments. Whitaker didn't just present his case, he painted a picture of Marcus as a dangerous young man, subtly playing on the jury's biases. He emphasized Marcus's background, his neighborhood, and his so-called type, weaving a narrative that had little to do with the facts and everything to do with fear. David rose for his closing argument, his voice steady but firm. The law promises justice for all, he began. But justice cannot exist without truth. Marcus Fields is not on trial because of what he did. He is on trial because of who he is. The words hung in the air, but as David looked into the faces of the jurors, he saw doubt, discomfort, and resignation. They weren't ready to confront their biases. When the verdict came back guilty, David's heart sank. Marcus's mother let out a wail, her hands trembling as she gripped the bench. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. David put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the words he wanted to say wouldn't come. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed David, their questions cutting through the haze of his thoughts. Do you think your client got a fair trial? Was race a factor in the jury's decision? David paused, his gaze steady. Justice wasn't served today, but this fight isn't over. That night, David sat alone in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The loss weighed heavily on him, not just for Marcus, but for every client he'd represented who had faced the same uphill battle. He thought about walking away, about choosing a different path where the odds weren't so stacked against him. But as the hours passed, a quiet determination settled in his chest. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. Months after the verdict, David Carter threw himself back into his work with renewed focus. Each new case became an opportunity to hone his skills, to fight harder, and to push against the injustices that plagued the system. While Marcus Fields' wrongful conviction weighed heavily on him, it also fueled his determination to ensure no one else suffered the same fate. David started taking on pro bono cases, representing clients who couldn't afford legal help but deserved a fair defense. His relentless dedication began to draw attention, not just from his peers, but from the community. People who had once viewed him with skepticism now saw him as a beacon of hope. His office became a gathering place for those seeking advice, justice, or simply someone who would listen. One day, David was approached by an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Evelyn Porter, a respected community leader and former city council member. She was known for her sharp wit and unshakable commitment to equality. "Mr. Carter," she said, stepping into his modest office, "you're doing important work here, but it's time to think bigger." David raised an eyebrow. "Bigger? You've got the heart, the brains, and the grit, she said. This city doesn't just need lawyers like you, it needs judges like you. David blinked, caught off guard. A judge? Mrs. Porter nodded. The first black judge in this city's history. It's time, David. The thought had crossed David's mind before, but he had always dismissed it as a distant possibility. Becoming a judge meant not just navigating the legal system, it meant challenging the deeply ingrained biases of the very institution he sought to change. But as he looked into Mrs. Porter's unwavering gaze, he felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. I'll think about it, he said cautiously. You'd better do more than think, she replied with a knowing smile. This city needs you. The road to the bench was far from easy. David faced resistance from every corner, politicians who questioned his qualifications, colleagues who whispered behind his back, and even members of the public who clung to their prejudices. But for every obstacle, there were also allies, community members who rallied behind him, former clients who shared their stories of his dedication, and mentors who guided him through the process. One of those allies was Judge Miriam Alvarez, a seasoned jurist who had broken barriers in her own right. You've got what it takes, David, she said during one of their conversations. But remember, being a judge isn't just about knowing the law. It's about embodying fairness, empathy, and integrity, and you've got all three. Her words stayed with David as he filed his candidacy papers and began campaigning. He knocked on doors, spoke at town halls, and shared his vision for a justice system that served everyone equally. The process was grueling, but with each conversation, David felt more certain that this was where he was meant to be. The night of the election results, David gathered with friends, family, and supporters at a local community centre. The room buzzed with anticipation as the final votes were tallied. When the announcement came, David Carter has been elected judge, the room erupted in cheers and applause. David stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the faces of those who had believed in him. This isn't just a victory for me, he began, his voice steady. It's a victory for every person who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or unfairly judged. Together, we're going to build a system that truly delivers justice for everyone. David's first day on the bench was both surreal and humbling. As he donned the black robe and entered the courtroom, he felt the weight of his new role, but also the strength of his purpose. The same courtroom where he had once faced bias and defeat now felt like a place of possibility. Over the years, David became known as a fair and compassionate judge, one who listened carefully and ruled with integrity. He worked tirelessly to ensure that every person who came before him was treated with dignity, regardless of their background. His presence on the bench sent a powerful message. Change was possible. One day, as David reviewed a case file in his chambers, he received a letter. It was from Marcus Fields, the young man whose case had sparked his journey. Marcus had been released after new evidence exonerated him, and he wanted to thank David for never giving up on him. You believed in me when no one else did, the letter read. Because of you, I have my life back. Thank you for fighting for justice, then and now. David set the letter down, a lump forming in his throat. Marcus's words were a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he had persevered despite the odds. Years later, during a ceremony honouring his contributions to the legal system, David stood before a crowd that included judges, attorneys, and community members. Among them were faces he recognised, former critics who now spoke of him with respect, young lawyers who saw him as a mentor, and children who dreamed of following in his footsteps. As he accepted the award, David's thoughts turned to the boy he had been, sitting in law school lectures and dreaming of a better world. He had faced prejudice, loss, and doubt, but he had also found resilience, purpose, and hope. Justice, David said, addressing the crowd, isn't just about the law. It's about people. It's about listening, understanding, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The room erupted in applause, but David's gaze was steady, his mind already focused on the work ahead. For him, the journey wasn't about awards or accolades. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, one case at a time. Jalen had always known how people saw him. Growing up as a young black man in a suburban neighborhood meant constantly navigating suspicion, sidelong glances, and the ever-present hum of mistrust. That night was no different. He had just finished a late study session at the local library, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, when he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. "Great," he muttered, pulling over to the curb. The officer approached with a deliberate stride, his flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. Jalen lowered his window, already reaching for his license and registration. He knew the routine. Keep your hands visible. Be polite. Don't give them a reason to escalate. "License and registration," the officer barked. Jalen complied, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man, whose name badge read Thompson, ignored the question. His sharp eyes flicked between Jalen's face and his documents. "What are you doing out here this late?" "I was at the library," Jalen said evenly. "Heading home now." Thompson didn't respond right away. He seemed distracted, glancing back at his squad car, where the radio crackled faintly. His face was tight with tension, his posture stiff. Jalen frowned. He could tell something was off. "Are you okay?" he asked cautiously. Thompson's head snapped back toward him. "What?" "You seem distracted," Jalen said, careful to keep his tone neutral. For a moment, Thompson's stern mask cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "It's none of your business," he said gruffly, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. Jalen hesitated, debating whether to push further. Against his better judgment, he spoke again. "Look, I know I'm just some guy you pulled over, but maybe I can help. What's going on?" The officer stared at him, clearly torn. Finally, as if the weight of whatever he was carrying was too much to bear, he exhaled sharply. "It's my daughter," he admitted. "She ran off after a fight. She's not answering her phone, and I don't know where she is." Jalen's chest tightened. "How old is she?" 14, Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jalen nodded, his mind racing. "Have you checked the places she usually goes? Friends' houses? Parks?" "I've checked everywhere I can think of," Thompson said, frustration etched into his features. "She's out there somewhere, and it's getting colder by the minute." Jalen glanced at the officer's squad car, then back at him. He could walk away, this wasn't his problem. But something in Thompson's voice, the sheer desperation, made it impossible to turn his back. "I'll help you look," Jalen said firmly. Thompson blinked. "What?" "I'll help," Jalen repeated. "Two sets of eyes are better than one, right?" Thompson hesitated, clearly wrestling with the idea. But finally he nodded. "Fine. But you stick close." The search took them across the quiet suburban streets, the air growing colder as the night deepened. They started with the nearby park, its empty swing set creaking in the wind. Then they checked a strip of fast food restaurants, their neon signs casting eerie glows on the deserted sidewalks. As they walked, Jalen tried to break the silence. "You said she ran off after a fight. What happened?" Thompson sighed, his flashlight sweeping over a row of empty benches. "I told her she couldn't go to a party. She's been hanging around with this group of kids I don't trust. I wanted to keep her safe." Jalen nodded. "Sounds like you care about her a lot." "Of course I do," Thompson snapped, then softened. "She's all I've got since her mum passed away." Jalen's heart ached at the raw pain in the man's voice. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. They searched for hours, their shared goal creating an unlikely bond. At one point, they stopped at a deserted bus stop, its flickering fluorescent light casting strange shadows. Jalen noticed a girl's scarf caught on a nearby bush, its vibrant blue fabric standing out against the darkness. "Over here," he called, holding up the scarf. Thompson's eyes widened as he grabbed it. "It's hers." Jalen's pulse quickened. "She can't be far." They followed a narrow path behind the bus stop, the air growing colder and the trees denser. Finally, they spotted her, a small figure huddled beneath a cluster of bushes, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Emma!" Thompson called, his voice breaking. The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and frightened. "Dad!" Thompson rushed forward, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his arms. "Oh, thank God," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Jalen hung back, watching the reunion with a mixture of relief and warmth. He didn't want to intrude on the moment, but he couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at his lips. After a few minutes, Thompson turned to him, his face a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Shame. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this." Jalen shrugged. "She's just a kid. Kids shouldn't have to be out here alone." Thompson hesitated, then added, "Look, I owe you an apology. When I pulled you over, I assumed things about you, things that weren't fair." Jalen met his gaze evenly. "You're not the first, won't be the last." "That doesn't make it right," Thompson said, his voice firm. "Tonight, you showed me something I didn't want to see, that I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things." Jalen didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "Maybe next time you'll think twice." "I will," Thompson promised. "You have my word." As Thompson drove away with Emma safely beside him, Jalen stood alone under the flickering light of the bus stop. The night was quiet now, the chaos and tension of the search fading into stillness. Jalen exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. He hadn't planned to be anyone's hero, but tonight he had made a difference. And as he started walking home, the weight of the evening settling over him, he allowed himself to hope, just for a moment, that the world could change. One small act of kindness at a time. The roaring crowd filled the arena, their cheers and chants reverberating off the steel beams. On the track, Eli Thompson adjusted his spikes and took a deep breath, trying to block out the noise and the stares. As one of the few black athletes in the regional track circuit, he had grown accustomed to the whispers, the side glances, and occasionally the outright hostility. But today felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. At the starting line, his main rival, Nate Carter, smirked as he adjusted his headband. "Hope you can keep up, Thompson," Nate said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Wouldn't want you to trip over your ego." Eli clenched his jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. Nate was the hometown favourite, a tall blonde sprinter with a cocky demeanour and an uncanny knack for riling up his competitors. The two had faced off many times, and while Eli had beaten Nate before, the victories never came without a price. The taunts, the glares from fans, the subtle and not so subtle reminders that Eli wasn't one of them. "You'll need more than words to win," Eli shot back, his voice calm but firm. The official called the racers to their positions, and Eli focused on the lane ahead. The 400-metre dash wasn't just a race to him, it was a test of resilience, a chance to prove that he belonged, no matter what anyone thought. The gunshot echoed, and the racers exploded off the blocks. Eli's heart pounded as he found his rhythm, his legs churning like pistons. For a moment it was just him and the track, the roar of the crowd fading into the background. But as he rounded the final curve, the noise returned, and with it, the jeers. "Go back where you came from," someone shouted. Eli gritted his teeth, pushing harder. He passed Nate in the final stretch, his body straining as he crossed the finish line a fraction of a second ahead. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in a mixture of cheers and boos. As Eli caught his breath, Nate approached, his face flushed with anger. "Don't get used to it, Thompson," he spat. "This was a fluke." Eli stared at him, his chest heaving. "Maybe next time you'll focus on running instead of talking." Nate sneered and walked away, leaving Eli alone at the finish line. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the animosity that clung to the air. Back in the locker room, Eli sat on the bench, his head in his hands. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. His coach, Coach Ramirez, sat beside him. "You did good out there, kid," the coach said, his tone encouraging. "Did I?" Eli replied, his voice laced with frustration. "Doesn't feel like it." Coach Ramirez sighed. "You're not just running a race, Eli. You're challenging a lot of people's assumptions. That's not easy, but it's important." Eli nodded, though the words offered little comfort. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting this uphill battle. The next few meets followed a similar pattern. Eli ran his races, often finishing in the top 3, but the hostility remained. Nate was relentless, always finding new ways to undermine him. "You're fast, Thompson," Nate said after one race, "but you'll never be a real champion. Not here." Eli wanted to snap back, to tell Nate exactly what he thought of him, but he held his tongue, channeling his anger into his training instead. Then came the state championship, a high-stakes event that drew athletes and spectators from across the region. Eli and Nate were both favourites to win, their rivalry the talk of the circuit. As the racers warmed up, the tension was palpable. This wasn't just a race, it was a proving ground. Eli stood at the starting line, his muscles coiled like springs. He could feel the weight of the crowd's expectations, both for and against him. Beside him, Nate grinned, his confidence unshaken. "Ready to lose, Thompson?" Nate taunted. "Ready to run," Eli replied, his voice steady. The official raised the gun, and the crowd fell silent. The race began with an electric energy surging through the stadium. Eli's feet pounded against the track, his movements fluid and powerful. Each stride carried him closer to the finish line, his focus razor-sharp. Nate was just ahead, their rivalry fueling the tension that gripped the crowd. For a moment, it was only the race that mattered, until it wasn't. Eli saw it first, a wobble in Nate's stride, the subtle loss of rhythm. In the blink of an eye, Nate's foot clipped the edge of the track, and his body twisted awkwardly before crashing onto the asphalt. He let out a sharp cry, clutching his leg as the momentum scraped him across the rough surface. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Eli's instincts kicked in. He slowed his pace, the finish line just meters away, and glanced back at Nate writhing on the ground. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but only one stood out. He needs help. Without hesitation, Eli stopped and turned around. The decision cost him the race, but in that moment, winning didn't matter. He sprinted back to Nate, kneeling beside him as the other racers charged past. "Hey, stay still," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "What hurts?" Nate's face twisted in pain. "My ankle. I think it's broken." Eli looked down at Nate's swollen, discoloured ankle and winced. "You'll be okay," he said. "I've got you." The medics arrived moments later, their stretcher and medical bags in tow. They worked quickly, stabilising Nate's leg, but Eli didn't move from his side. He held Nate's shoulder, offering reassurance as the crowd murmured in the background. "You didn't have to stop," Nate muttered, his voice strained. "Why'd you do it?" Eli met his gaze, his expression steady. "Because it was the right thing to do." Nate didn't respond, but the flicker of gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. As the medics carried Nate off the track, Eli stood and dusted off his hands. He turned toward the finish line, which seemed impossibly far now. The race was long over, the winners already celebrating, but Eli jogged to the end anyway. When he crossed, the crowd erupted, not with the usual half-hearted applause, but with a thunderous standing ovation. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of their acknowledgement, their cheers filled with something he hadn't experienced here before. Genuine respect. After the race, Eli sat in the locker room, his body exhausted, but his mind restless. He replayed the events over and over, wondering if he had made the right decision. He had sacrificed a hard-earned opportunity to win, but somehow the victory didn't seem as important anymore. Coach Ramirez walked in, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "That was one hell of a move, Eli," he said, sitting beside him. "I didn't even finish in the top 3, Eli replied, his tone laced with doubt. Coach Ramirez shook his head. You did something bigger than winning a race. People saw who you really are today. That matters more than any medal. Eli nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had spent so long fighting for recognition, for a place in a world that seemed determined to push him out. Today, he had shown them something they couldn't ignore. In the days following the race, Eli's actions became the talk of the community. Videos of the moment went viral, shared widely with captions praising his sportsmanship and selflessness. For the first time, Eli felt seen, not just as a competitor, but as a person. The transformation wasn't limited to the crowd. Nate, once so arrogant and dismissive, began to change too. After the doctors confirmed his ankle was fractured, he reached out to Eli with an unexpected request. "Can we talk?" Nate said, finding Eli in the training room a week later. Eli raised an eyebrow, surprised but curious. "Sure." Nate hesitated, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something softer. "I've been a jerk," he admitted. "Not just to you, to a lot of people. I guess I thought being on top meant keeping everyone else down." Eli folded his arms, waiting. "But what you did out there," Nate continued, his voice faltering. "It made me realize I've been wrong. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'm grateful." Eli studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "It's never too late to change." Nate smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Thanks for everything." The next time they raced, the atmosphere was different. The animosity that had once defined their rivalry was gone, replaced by mutual respect. Before the race began, Nate extended a fist toward Eli. "Let's give them something to cheer for," Nate said. Eli grinned, bumping his fist. "Let's do it." As the race unfolded, the two pushed each other to their limits, their strides synchronized in a display of pure athleticism. When they crossed the finish line, Eli just a fraction ahead, the crowd erupted, their cheers louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just about who won. It was about what the race had come to represent. Resilience, unity, and the power of doing what's right. The ripple effects of Eli's actions extended far beyond the track. Athletes who had once ignored him now sought him out, asking for advice and offering encouragement. Fans who had jeered him in the past now cheered his name, their attitudes shifting as they recognized the strength of his character. Even the local media took notice, writing articles about the transformative power of sportsmanship. One piece, titled "The Runner Who Stopped," highlighted Eli's choice to prioritize humanity over victory, calling it a moment that redefined what it means to be a champion. Months later, at a community event honoring local athletes, Eli and Nate stood side by side, receiving awards for their contributions to the sport. As they took the stage, Nate leaned toward the microphone. Without hesitation, Eli stopped and turned around. The decision cost him the race, but in that moment, winning didn't matter. He sprinted back to Nate, kneeling beside him as the other racers charged past. "Hey, stay still," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "What hurts?" Nate's face twisted in pain. "My ankle. I think it's broken." Eli looked down at Nate's swollen, discolored ankle and winced. "You'll be okay," he said. "I've got you." The medics arrived moments later, their stretcher and medical bags in tow. They worked quickly, stabilizing Nate's leg, but Eli didn't move from his side. He held Nate's shoulder, offering reassurance as the crowd murmured in the background. "You didn't have to stop," Nate muttered, his voice strained. "Why'd you do it?" Eli met his gaze, his expression steady. "Because it was the right thing to do." Nate didn't respond, but the flicker of gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. As the medics carried Nate off the track, Eli stood and dusted off his hands. He turned toward the finish line, which seemed impossibly far now. The race was long over, the winners already celebrating, but Eli jogged to the end anyway. When he crossed, the crowd erupted, not with the usual half-hearted applause, but with a thunderous standing ovation. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of their acknowledgement, their cheers filled with something he hadn't experienced here before. Genuine respect. After the race, Eli sat in the locker room, his body exhausted, but his mind restless. He replayed the events over and over, wondering if he had made the right decision. He had sacrificed a hard-earned opportunity to win, but somehow the victory didn't seem as important anymore. Coach Ramirez walked in, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "That was one hell of a move, Eli," he said, sitting beside him. "I didn't even finish in the top 3, Eli replied, his tone laced with doubt. Coach Ramirez shook his head. "You did something bigger than winning a race. People saw who you really are today. That matters more than any medal." Eli nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had spent so long fighting for recognition, for a place in a world that seemed determined to push him out. Today, he had shown them something they couldn't ignore. In the days following the race, Eli's actions became the talk of the community. Videos of the moment went viral, shared widely with captions praising his sportsmanship and selflessness. For the first time, Eli felt seen, not just as a competitor, but as a person. The transformation wasn't limited to the crowd. Nate, once so arrogant and dismissive, began to change too. After the doctors confirmed his ankle was fractured, he reached out to Eli with an unexpected request. "Can we talk?" Nate said, finding Eli in the training room a week later. Eli raised an eyebrow, surprised but curious. "Sure." Nate hesitated, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something softer. "I've been a jerk," he admitted. "Not just to you, to a lot of people. I guess I thought being on top meant keeping everyone else down." Eli folded his arms, waiting. "But what you did out there," Nate continued, his voice faltering. "It made me realize I've been wrong. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'm grateful." Eli studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "It's never too late to change." Nate smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Thanks for everything." The next time they raced, the atmosphere was different. The animosity that had once defined their rivalry was gone, replaced by mutual respect. Before the race began, Nate extended a fist toward Eli. "Let's give them something to cheer for," Nate said. Eli grinned, bumping his fist. "Let's do it." As the race unfolded, the two pushed each other to their limits, their strides synchronized in a display of pure athleticism. When they crossed the finish line, Eli just a fraction ahead, the crowd erupted, their cheers louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just about who won. It was about what the race had come to represent. Resilience, unity, and the power of doing what's right. The ripple effects of Eli's actions extended far beyond the track. Athletes who had once ignored him now sought him out, asking for advice and offering encouragement. Fans who had jeered him in the past now cheered his name, their attitudes shifting as they recognized the strength of his character. Even the local media took notice, writing articles about the transformative power of sportsmanship. One piece, titled "The Runner Who Stopped," highlighted Eli's choice to prioritize humanity over victory, calling it a moment that redefined what it means to be a champion. Months later, at a community event honoring local athletes, Eli and Nate stood side by side, receiving awards for their contributions to the sport. As they took the stage, Nate leaned toward the microphone. "I used to think being a winner meant crossing the finish line first," Nate said, his voice steady. "But Eli taught me it's about more than that. It's about how you treat people along the way." The audience erupted into applause, and Eli felt a warmth spread through him. For so long, he had fought to be seen, to prove his worth. Now, he stood on a stage, not as an outsider, but as a leader, a reminder of what could happen when people chose compassion over competition. As the applause continued, Eli glanced at Nate and smiled. "I couldn't have said it better myself." Years later, Eli looked back on that race as a turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. The decision to stop had cost him a medal, but it had given him something far more valuable. A sense of purpose, a chance to inspire change, and the knowledge that one act of kindness could ripple outward in ways he had never imagined. And as he laced up his spikes for another race, he knew that no matter what happened, he had already won. The faint smell of motor oil and hot asphalt lingered in the air as Marcus Hill tightened the last bolt on a transmission. His small auto repair shop, nestled on the outskirts of Pinewood, was more than just a workplace. It was his sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the hum of engines and the rhythmic clang of tools, Marcus found purpose. Despite his skill and reputation as a reliable mechanic, Marcus often faced the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that permeated the small town. Some customers would barely make eye contact, others questioned his prices more harshly than they would anyone else. But Marcus had learned to let it roll off his back, focusing instead on the satisfaction of a job well done. One sweltering afternoon, the sound of tyres crunching on gravel caught Marcus's attention. He glanced up from under the hood of an old pickup to see a sleek, black sedan pulling into the lot. The car was immaculate, except for the faint trail of smoke curling from under its hood. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Samuel Reed. Marcus recognized him immediately. Samuel was a local businessman with a sharp tongue and a reputation for being cold, especially toward anyone who didn't fit his mold of acceptable. Marcus had seen Samuel in passing, but had never exchanged more than a curt nod. Samuel approached with an air of impatience, his tie loosened and his face pinched. "You Marcus Hill?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That's me," Marcus replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "My car's overheating," Samuel said, gesturing toward the sedan. "I need it fixed, fast." Marcus walked over, lifting the hood. The heat radiating from the engine made him step back momentarily. "Looks like a busted radiator," he said after a quick inspection. "It's not a quick fix, but I can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" Samuel's voice rose. "I need this car for a meeting tonight." Marcus straightened, meeting Samuel's gaze. "It's not a job I can rush. If I don't fix it properly, you'll be stranded on the side of the road again." Samuel muttered something under his breath, but Marcus caught it. Should have gone somewhere else. Marcus felt a pang of anger but forced himself to remain calm. "It's your choice," he said evenly. "But if you want it done right, I'll take care of it." Samuel hesitated, then threw up his hands. "Fine, just get it done." By the time Samuel left, Marcus was already elbows deep in the repair. He worked late into the night, the rhythmic sound of his tools punctuating the silence of the shop. Despite Samuel's attitude, Marcus couldn't bring himself to cut corners. He prided himself on his work, and he wasn't about to let anyone, friend or foe, drive off in a car that wasn't safe. As he tightened the last hose and wiped down the engine, Marcus leaned back and exhaled. The car was ready, and he'd made sure it was in top condition. The next afternoon, Samuel returned. He inspected the car as if searching for flaws, his expression unreadable. "It runs fine?" he asked, his tone begrudging. "Better than fine," Marcus replied, handing over the keys. "You're good to go." Samuel paid without a word of thanks, climbed into the car, and drove off. Marcus shook his head, returning to his work. He doubted he'd see Samuel again, and frankly, he wasn't in a hurry to. But fate had other plans. Weeks passed, and Marcus nearly forgot about Samuel Reed and his sleek sedan. He busied himself with a steady stream of customers, each repair reminding him why he loved his craft. But one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, a familiar car rolled into his lot. Samuel stepped out, his expression softer than before but still reserved. "Got a minute?" he asked. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, raising an eyebrow. "What's the problem?" "No problem," Samuel said, almost sheepishly. "Just wanted to say the car's been running perfectly since you worked on it, better than it ever has, so, thanks." Marcus nodded, caught off guard. "Glad to hear it." Samuel hesitated, then added, "And I might need your help with something else." Curiosity piqued, Marcus gestured for him to continue. "It's my wife's car," Samuel explained. "She's got an old Jeep, and it's been giving her trouble. I told her you'd take a look." The request surprised Marcus, but he agreed. Bring it by tomorrow. The next day, Samuel returned with the jeep, and this time he lingered in the shop while Marcus worked. He asked questions about the tools, the parts, and even Marcus's process. Though his tone was still a bit guarded, there was a genuine interest behind his words. As the hours went by, the conversation turned more personal. Samuel asked how Marcus had gotten into auto repair, and Marcus shared his story, how his father had taught him to fix engines in their small backyard, how he'd saved up for years to open his own shop, and how he took pride in providing honest work. Samuel listened intently, his posture relaxing. You know, he said, I always assumed people in your line of work cut corners. But you don't. Nope, Marcus replied simply. A job's worth doing right, or it's not worth doing at all. Samuel nodded, as if weighing the words. I respect that. Over the next few months, Samuel became a regular at the shop. Whether it was his car, his wife's Jeep, or his daughter's old station wagon, he trusted Marcus to keep his family's vehicles running smoothly. But it wasn't just about the cars. Samuel began to linger after each visit, their conversations growing deeper and more personal. One evening, after Marcus had finished tuning up the station wagon, Samuel leaned against the counter and sighed. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the first time I came here. Oh? Marcus said, his tone neutral. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically vulnerable. I was rude. No, I was worse than rude. I judged you before I even knew you. Marcus set down the wrench he was holding and met Samuel's gaze. You did. Samuel winced, but didn't look away. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice caught Marcus off guard. For a moment he didn't know what to say. Finally he nodded. Takes a big man to admit that. Samuel let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing. Well, I owe you more than an apology. You've been nothing but honest and hard-working, and I respect the hell out of that. The turning point in their relationship came one stormy night. Marcus was locking up the shop when he heard a frantic knock at the door. It was Samuel, soaked from head to toe, his face pale with worry. It's my daughter, Samuel said. She broke down on Route 12, and her phone's dead. I don't know what to do. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his jacket and keys. Let's go. They drove through the rain, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. When they found Samuel's daughter, Emily, stranded on the side of the road, Marcus quickly assessed the situation. Her car's alternator had failed, leaving her without power. Within minutes, he had the car towed back to the shop and offered her a warm drink while he worked. As Samuel watched Marcus fix the car, his gratitude was palpable. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly, but you did. Marcus shrugged. It's what neighbours do. Samuel smiled faintly. I'm starting to realise that. From that night on, their relationship deepened into something unexpected. Friendship. Samuel began stopping by the shop, even when he didn't need a repair, bringing coffee or sandwiches and chatting with Marcus about everything from cars to family to the state of the world. Marcus found himself enjoying the conversations, appreciating the way Samuel's perspective had shifted. One day, Samuel brought Marcus a gift, a framed photo of the two of them standing in front of the shop, taken by Emily. For the wall, Samuel said, grinning. Marcus laughed. Guess this makes it official. Word of Marcus's integrity and skill spread throughout Pinewood, and his business thrived. But what meant more to him was the respect he'd earned, not just from Samuel, but from the community as a whole. People who had once looked past him now sought him out, eager to work with a man they knew they could trust. One evening, as Marcus locked up for the night, Samuel pulled up in his sedan. Hey, he said, stepping out. Thought you should know, I recommended you to a buddy of mine. He owns a fleet of trucks and needs someone reliable to maintain them. Appreciate that, Marcus said, smiling. Samuel nodded, then added, You've taught me a lot, Marcus. Not just about cars, but about people. I'm lucky to know you. Marcus shook his head, his grin widening. "We're both lucky, Samuel, and you're not such a bad guy yourself." As they stood there, the sun setting behind them, Marcus couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. What had started with hostility and prejudice had turned into something rare and meaningful, a friendship built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to doing what was right. And as Samuel drove away, Marcus knew this was more than just a story about fixing cars. It was a story about fixing hearts. The first day of school at Brookfield High was always a mixture of excitement and chaos. Students shuffled through the hallways, their laughter and chatter echoing off the polished floors. Teachers greeted each other with smiles, swapping summer stories as they prepared for the year ahead. For Cameron Ellis, this wasn't just the start of a new school year, it was the beginning of a new chapter. At 32, Cameron was stepping into his first role as a full-time history teacher. A tall, soft-spoken man with a passion for education, he had dreamed of this opportunity for years. But as he walked into the faculty lounge that morning, he couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The glances started almost immediately, quick, fleeting looks from some of his colleagues as he introduced himself. A few smiled warmly, but others kept their distance, their expressions unreadable. Cameron had grown used to this reaction in his life, but it didn't make it any easier. "Mr. Ellis, right?" A woman with curly blonde hair approached him, her hand outstretched. "I'm Jessica Green. I teach English next door to your classroom. Welcome to Brookfield." "Thank you," Cameron said, shaking her hand. "I'm excited to be here." Jessica's smile was genuine, and Cameron felt a small wave of relief. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," she said, before heading back to her desk. As the bell rang, signalling the start of first period, Cameron gathered his materials and made his way to his classroom. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. 20 pairs of eyes turned to him, some curious, others bored, and a few already sizing him up. "Good morning, everyone," Cameron said, his voice steady. "My name is Mr. Ellis, and I'll be your history teacher this year." The first week passed in a blur of lesson plans and introductions. Most of the students were polite, though a few seemed determined to test his patience. It wasn't until the end of the week that Cameron encountered his first real challenge. During a lecture on Reconstruction, a student named Tyler muttered something under his breath. Cameron couldn't catch the words, but the smirks from the other students told him it wasn't complimentary. "Care to share with the class, Tyler?" Cameron asked, his tone firm but calm. Tyler shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Just saying it's funny how someone like you is teaching this stuff. Seems ironic." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Cameron's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "History has a lot to teach us about irony," he said evenly, "and respect." The laughter faded, and Tyler's smirk disappeared. But the moment lingered in Cameron's mind, long after the bell rang. The incidents became more frequent as the weeks went on. Snide comments, whispered jokes, and subtle acts of defiance. Cameron recognized the undercurrent of prejudice, and though it hurt, he refused to let it show. He focused on his lessons, determined to prove himself through his work. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult class, Cameron stayed late to grade papers. The school was quiet, the hallways empty, when he heard the squeak of a mop bucket. He glanced out the door and saw the janitor, a wiry elderly man with a weathered face, cleaning the floor. "Long day?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. "You could say that," Cameron replied, stepping into the hallway. The janitor smiled, leaning on his mop. "Kids giving you trouble?" Cameron hesitated, then nodded. "A little. Nothing I can't handle." "I'm sure you can," the man said, "but it doesn't make it any less exhausting." Cameron chuckled softly. "You've been here a while, I take it?" "Longer than most," the man said. "Name's Mr. Carter. If you need anything, just holler." "Thanks, Mr. Carter," Cameron said, extending a hand. "I'm Cameron." As they shook hands, Cameron noticed the strength in the older man's grip, a testament to years of hard work. There was something steadying about his presence, and Cameron felt a small flicker of hope. Over the next few weeks, Cameron and Mr. Carter developed an easy rapport. They often crossed paths after school, sharing brief conversations about life, work, and the challenges of dealing with unruly students. Cameron learned that Mr. Carter had been at Brookfield for decades, though he rarely talked about his past. One evening, as Cameron packed up his bag, he saw Mr. Carter struggling to lift a heavy box in the supply closet. Without hesitation, Cameron rushed over to help. "Let me get that," Cameron said, hoisting the box with ease. "Appreciate it," Mr. Carter said, brushing the dust off his hands. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." "What's in here anyway?" Cameron asked, setting the box down on a nearby table. "Just some old records," Mr. Carter replied. "Probably should have been tossed years ago." Cameron glanced at the label on the box, Principal's Office, 1985 to 1995. He looked at Mr. Carter, his curiosity piqued. "You were a principal?" Mr. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "A long time ago, this was my school." Cameron's eyes widened. "What happened?" Mr. Carter sighed, his gaze distant. "That's a story for another day." Cameron wanted to press him, but something in Mr. Carter's tone made him hold back. Instead, he nodded and said, "Whenever you're ready." Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Mr. Ellis. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The following week, Cameron couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Mr. Carter. A principal turned janitor? The thought unsettled him, not because of the position itself, but because of the unspoken weight behind Mr. Carter's words. He sensed there was more to the story, something important. One evening after school, Cameron found Mr. Carter sweeping the hallway outside the library. He approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "Mr. Carter," Cameron began, "I've been thinking about what you told me last week. If you're willing, I'd really like to hear your story." Mr. Carter leaned on his broom, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, Cameron thought he might refuse, but then the older man nodded. "All right, Mr. Ellis, let's take a walk." They ended up in the school's empty cafeteria, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. Mr. Carter sat heavily at one of the tables, gesturing for Cameron to join him. "This school used to be my pride and joy," Mr. Carter began, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I started teaching here in the late 70s, back when the town was still adjusting to integration. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of folks who didn't want someone like me in a position of authority. But I worked hard, built relationships, and eventually earned their respect." Cameron listened intently, picturing a younger Mr. Carter walking these same hallways, his presence commanding yet kind. "In 1985, I became the first black principal of Brookfield High," Mr. Carter continued. "For a while, it felt like progress. I pushed for changes, more inclusive curricula, programs to support underprivileged students. Some people embraced it, others, not so much." His voice grew quieter, his gaze distant. Then came the scandal. Cameron leaned forward. "What happened?" "There was a fight," Mr. Carter said, his jaw tightening. "Two boys, one black, one white, got into it during lunch. The white boy threw the first punch, but the other kid fought back harder. I disciplined them both, like the handbook said, but the parents weren't happy. The white boy's father accused me of being biased, claimed I was trying to ruin his son's future." Cameron frowned. "That's ridiculous." "It didn't matter," Mr. Carter said bitterly. "The school board launched an investigation. They didn't find anything, of course, but by then, the damage was done. My reputation was tarnished, and the board pressured me to resign. I didn't fight it. I thought stepping down would protect the school, but looking back I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder." "And after that?" Cameron asked. "I couldn't leave this place," Mr. Carter admitted. "I love this school, these kids, so I stayed on as a janitor, quietly doing what I could to make a difference." Cameron felt a surge of anger and admiration. "You've done more than most people ever would. The students here are lucky to have you." Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Mr. Ellis, and so are you." The next day, Cameron walked into his classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Mr. Carter's story had reminded him why he'd become a teacher, to make a difference, even in the face of adversity. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. After school, Cameron approached Jessica Green in the faculty lounge. "Jessica, can I talk to you about something?" "Of course," she said, setting down her coffee. "What's on your mind?" Cameron hesitated, then said, "I've been struggling with how some of the students, and even a few staff members, treat me. But I think it's bigger than me. There's a culture here that needs to change." Jessica nodded, her expression serious. "You're not wrong. I've noticed it too, and I've been meaning to say something. What do you have in mind?" Cameron explained his idea, a school-wide initiative to foster respect, inclusion, and understanding. He wanted to create workshops, invite guest speakers, and even incorporate lessons about equity and empathy into the curriculum. Jessica listened intently, her enthusiasm growing. "I'm in," she said firmly. "And I think I know a few other teachers who'd want to help." With Jessica's support, Cameron began working on the initiative. He also enlisted Mr. Carter's help, knowing his story could inspire both staff and students. At first, Mr. Carter was hesitant. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight anymore, but Cameron convinced him that his voice was essential. The first workshop took place in the auditorium, attended by students, teachers, and even a few parents. Cameron opened with a heartfelt speech about his own experiences, emphasizing the importance of kindness and understanding. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Carter took the stage. The room fell silent as Mr. Carter shared his story. He spoke about his journey as an educator, the challenges he'd faced, and the love he still had for the school despite everything. His words were honest, powerful, and deeply moving. When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. For the first time in years, Mr. Carter stood tall, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of his past. The initiative gained momentum in the weeks that followed. Students who had once been skeptical began participating in discussions and activities, their perspectives shifting as they learned more about each other. Teachers who had been indifferent started embracing the changes, recognizing the positive impact on the school community. Even Tyler, the student who had mocked Cameron on his first day, approached him after class one afternoon. "Mr. Ellis," he said awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way I acted." Cameron smiled, his voice warm. "Apology accepted, Tyler. Let's move forward." By the end of the school year, Brookfield High was a different place. The halls were filled with laughter and conversation, the barriers between students and staff beginning to fade. Cameron and Mr. Carter had become a formidable team, their partnership a testament to the power of resilience and understanding. On the last day of school, the faculty held a small celebration in honor of Mr. Carter. The principal, who had been inspired by the initiative, presented him with a plaque that read, "To Mr. Carter, whose dedication and courage remind us all what it means to lead." As Mr. Carter accepted the plaque, he turned to Cameron with a smile. "You did this," he said quietly. "No," Cameron replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "We did this." And as the room erupted into applause, Cameron felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come to Brookfield hoping to make a difference, but he had gained so much more: a friend, a mentor, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ignite change. The morning started like any other at the Maplewood post office. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights filled the room, accompanied by the shuffle of papers and the occasional ring of the service bell. Behind the counter, Leah Carter moved with practiced efficiency, scanning packages, assisting customers, and answering questions with her characteristic warmth. Her role as a postal clerk wasn't glamorous, but she took pride in her work. It was steady, honest, and served the community she loved. But that day, the usual rhythm was shattered. "Excuse me, I need to speak with someone in charge, right now." A man's voice boomed through the lobby, sharp and accusatory. He stormed up to the counter, his face red and his hands clutching a crumpled receipt. Leah glanced up, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" "You can help by telling me where my package is," he snapped. "It was supposed to be delivered yesterday. It's worth thousands of dollars and now it's gone." Leah's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that. Let me look into it for you. Can I see the receipt?" The man shoved it across the counter. As Leah typed the tracking number into the system, she felt the weight of his glare. The computer screen loaded slowly, revealing the dreaded words: status, undeliverable, package missing. Leah's stomach sank. "It looks like the package was marked as undeliverable," she said carefully. "But I'll investigate this for you." "You'd better," the man growled. "I was told you were the one who handled it." The accusation hit her like a slap. Leah straightened, meeting his gaze. "I assure you, sir, I process hundreds of packages a day, and I treat them all with care." "Well, something happened," he said, his voice rising. "And I'm holding you responsible." The accusation spread through the post office like wildfire. By lunch, Leah could feel the change in her co-workers' demeanour. They avoided eye contact, whispered in corners, and some even gave her wary glances. The weight of their judgment settled heavily on her shoulders. She tried to focus on her work, but the knot in her chest tightened with each passing hour. It wasn't just the potential loss of her job that worried her. It was the sting of being doubted, the feeling of being isolated in a place where she had once felt respected. That evening, as Leah locked up the office, her supervisor, Mr. Hargrove, called her into his office. His expression was serious, and Leah braced herself. "Leah, we've received a formal complaint about the missing package," he said. "Until we figure out what happened, I have to place you under review." Her heart sank. "Mr. Hargrove, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't even remember handling that package specifically." "I believe you," he said gently, "but you know how these things go. The customer is demanding answers, and we need to provide them." Leah nodded, her throat tight. "I understand." As she left the office, Leah resolved to prove her innocence. She couldn't just wait for the investigation to run its course, not when her reputation and livelihood were on the line. That night, Leah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by receipts, notes, and printouts of tracking information. She combed through every detail of the package's journey, searching for anything that might explain its disappearance. The tracking data showed that the package had been scanned at the Maplewood facility, but never loaded onto the delivery truck. Somewhere between the counter and the truck, it had vanished. Leah frowned. If the package hadn't left the facility, then the answer had to be inside the post office. But where? The next morning, Leah arrived early, determined to retrace her steps. She checked the shelves, the storage room, and even the outgoing bins. Nothing. Frustration bubbled within her, but she refused to give up. As she searched, she noticed something odd. A corner of torn paper peeking out from beneath a shelf near the loading dock. Leah crouched down, reaching for it. Her fingers brushed against something solid, and she pulled out a small box, dusty and slightly crumpled. Her breath caught. It was the missing package. But her relief was short-lived. The shipping label had been partially torn off, and there was no way to prove who had mishandled it. Leah examined the shelf, noticing scuff marks on the floor as if the box had been kicked underneath. It was clear that someone had tried to hide it. Her pulse quickened. Someone in the post office had deliberately sabotaged her. Leah stared at the package in her hands, her mind racing. Someone had tried to sabotage her, and this box was the proof. But how could she prove who had done it? She needed more than a hunch. She needed evidence. Returning the package to its rightful place on the loading dock, Leah discreetly marked the shelf where she found it, using a piece of tape to remember the exact spot. She then headed to Mr. Hargrove's office. "Sir," she said, placing the package on his desk, "I found the missing shipment." His eyebrows shot up. "Where was it?" "It was kicked under a shelf near the loading dock," Leah explained, "but the label was damaged, and I don't think it got there by accident." Mr. Hargrove's expression darkened. "Are you saying someone intentionally hid it?" "It's the only explanation that makes sense," Leah said. "Packages don't just end up under shelves." Mr. Hargrove leaned back, his fingers steepled. This is serious, Leah. Do you have any idea who might be responsible? I don't, Leah admitted, but I want to find out. After a moment, Mr. Hargrove nodded. Let me review the security footage from the loading dock. If anyone mishandled this package, it should show up there. The following day, Mr. Hargrove called Leah into his office. His expression was grim as he gestured for her to sit. I reviewed the footage, he said, swiveling his monitor toward her, and I think you'll want to see this. Leah leaned in, her stomach twisting with anticipation. On the screen, grainy black and white footage showed the loading dock on the day the package went missing. Workers moved back and forth, sorting mail and loading trucks. Then Leah spotted him, Tom Jenkins, a co-worker who had always seemed a little too interested in her business. In the video, Tom glanced around before picking up the package in question. Instead of placing it in the correct bin, he tossed it carelessly toward the shelf. It landed on the floor, and with a quick kick, he shoved it underneath. Leah's chest tightened. Why would he do that? Mr. Hargrove sighed. I don't know, but it's clear this wasn't an accident. I'll handle Tom, and Leah. He hesitated, his tone softening. I owe you an apology. You've handled this situation with grace and professionalism, and I'm sorry for doubting you. Leah nodded, her emotions a mix of relief and lingering frustration. Thank you, sir. I just want to move forward. Later that day, Tom was called into the office and escorted out of the building, his employment terminated. Word spread quickly among the staff, and for the first time in weeks, Leah felt the weight of suspicion lift from her shoulders. But the experience had left its mark. She'd worked tirelessly to prove her innocence, and while she was glad the truth had come out, she couldn't ignore the way her co-workers had treated her during the investigation. Some had whispered behind her back, others had avoided her entirely, and a few had openly questioned her competence. Leah decided to address the issue head-on. During a staff meeting the following week, she stood up and spoke. I know this hasn't been an easy time for anyone, she began, her voice steady. But I want to say something. Being accused of something I didn't do was hard enough, but feeling like I didn't have the support of my team made it even harder. The room fell silent. Leah took a deep breath, continuing. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. We need to do better, not just in how we handle mistakes, but in how we treat each other. We're a team, and that should mean something. As she sat down, a few of her co-workers clapped, and one of them, Sarah, leaned over to whisper, You're right, Leah. We'll do better. A few weeks later, Leah received a call from Mr. Hargrove asking her to come to his office. When she arrived, she found him smiling, a rare sight. Leah, I wanted to thank you again for how you handled everything, he said. And I have some news. Corporate was impressed with how you resolved the situation, and they've approved a promotion for you. Leah blinked, stunned. A promotion? You're now the assistant manager of this branch, Mr. Hargrove said. It's well deserved. Tears pricked Leah's eyes as she processed his words. She had worked hard for years, but this recognition felt especially meaningful after everything she'd endured. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I won't let you down. The promotion brought new responsibilities, but it also gave Leah a chance to make a difference. She implemented new protocols to prevent mishandling of packages, including better tracking systems and additional training for staff. She also worked to foster a more supportive work environment, encouraging open communication and teamwork. Slowly but surely, the culture of the post office began to change. Co-workers who had once kept their distance now approached Leah with questions and ideas, and even customers seemed to notice the shift in atmosphere. One day, the man whose package had gone missing returned to the post office. He approached Leah at the counter, an apologetic look on his face. Ms. Carter, he said, I owe you an apology. I was out of line when I accused you. Thank you for finding my package. Leah smiled, her tone gracious. Apology accepted. I'm just glad we could make things right. As the man left, Leah felt a sense of closure, She had faced adversity and come out stronger, not just for herself, but for those around her. Months later, as Leah locked up the post office for the evening, she paused to look at the building she had called her workplace for so many years. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she had grown, fought for what was right, and found her voice. And as she walked to her car, the setting sun casting a warm glow over Maplewood, Leah knew she had built something more than a career. She had built trust, respect, and a legacy of resilience that would inspire others to do the same. The moving truck rumbled down the narrow tree-lined road leading into Fairfield, a quiet town nestled in the heart of the Midwest. Marcus Hayes followed closely in his old sedan, its trunk packed with the essentials of his life: books, tools, and a few framed photographs of his family. The sight of Fairfield's modest main street, with its red brick buildings and American flags fluttering in the breeze, gave Marcus a cautious sense of hope. This town, with its sprawling fields and close-knit community, was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of living in the city, Marcus had decided to take a job at a local woodworking shop, hoping the slower pace of life would give him the clarity and peace he had been searching for. But as he parked in front of his new rental house, the glances from neighbours were anything but welcoming. Across the street, a woman watering her garden paused, her expression guarded. A man in a pickup truck slowed as he drove past, his gaze lingering a little too long. Marcus sighed, the weight of unspoken judgment settling on his shoulders. He had experienced this before: the hesitation, the sideways glances, the quiet whispers. He knew it wasn't just because he was new to town. It was because he was different. Fairfield was a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. People valued tradition, routine, and familiarity. Marcus quickly realized that newcomers, especially someone who didn't fit the town's predominantly white demographic, were viewed with suspicion. At the local diner, conversation stopped when he walked in. At the hardware store, the clerk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus kept his head down, focusing on his work at the woodworking shop. He was skilled with his hands, crafting intricate furniture and restoring antiques. His boss, Tom, was polite but distant, treating Marcus more as an employee than a peer. The other workers were friendly enough but rarely included Marcus in their conversations about local events or weekend plans. One evening, as Marcus worked late sanding a table, Tom approached him. "You're doing good work," Tom said, his tone neutral. "But don't take it personally if folks around here keep their distance. We've had some trouble in the past. People aren't always quick to trust." Marcus nodded, though the comment stung. He knew trouble was a veiled reference to the town's wariness of outsiders, especially those who didn't look like them. But he was determined to prove himself, not through words, but through actions. A few weeks later, Marcus ventured to the local farmers' market, hoping to blend into the community. He browsed the stalls, admiring the fresh produce and handmade crafts. As he reached for a jar of honey, he overheard two women whispering nearby. "That's the new guy," one said, her tone low but audible. "Moved here from the city." "Heard he's one of those migrants," the other replied, her voice tinged with unease. "You know how they are." Marcus pretended not to hear, though his grip tightened on the jar. He paid for it and walked away, his chest heavy with frustration. He wanted to scream, to confront them, but he knew it wouldn't change their minds. Instead, he went home, vowing to keep his focus on his work. But doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake moving here? Could he ever truly belong in a place like Fairfield? One bright Saturday morning, Marcus decided to take a walk along the river that wound through the edge of town. It was peaceful, the water sparkling under the sunlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He found a quiet spot to sit and reflect, letting the sounds of nature soothe his troubled thoughts. That's when he heard it, a faint cry for help. Marcus sprang to his feet, scanning the river. About 50 yards downstream, he saw a little girl clinging to a rock, the current tugging at her small frame. Panic surged through him as he realized the danger she was in. Without hesitation, he kicked off his shoes and dove into the water. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at his legs as he swam toward the girl. "Hold on," he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. When he reached her, he wrapped an arm around her waist, gripping the rock with his free hand. "I've got you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're going to be okay." The girl sobbed, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Slowly, carefully, Marcus pushed off the rock and swam toward the riverbank. His muscles burned, but he focused on each stroke, determined to get her to safety. When they reached the shore, Marcus collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The girl clung to him, her tiny body trembling. A woman came running toward them, her face pale with fear. "Emily!" she cried, scooping the girl into her arms. "Oh my God, are you okay?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He saved me, Mama. He saved me." The woman turned to Marcus, her expression a mix of gratitude and shock. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Marcus waved off her thanks, still catching his breath. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time." As the woman led her daughter back toward town, Marcus sat on the riverbank, dripping wet and exhausted. He didn't realize it then, but his life in Fairfield was about to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. When Marcus woke the next morning, he expected life to carry on as usual. He had done what anyone should do, helped someone in need. But Fairfield had a way of holding on to stories, and this one spread faster than Marcus could have imagined. By the time he stepped out of his house, neighbours who had once ignored him now waved, their smiles tentative but genuine. Marcus wasn't sure how to feel. The attention was unexpected, almost overwhelming. At the diner, the usual murmurs and stares were replaced with hushed conversations about the new guy who had saved Emily Bennett. The owner, a burly man named Joe, even insisted on covering Marcus's breakfast. "It's on the house," Joe said gruffly, setting down a plate of pancakes. "You did good out there." "Thank you," Marcus replied, though the sudden kindness felt surreal. He ate quickly, eager to slip back into his routine. That afternoon, as Marcus worked on a table at the woodworking shop, a shadow fell across his workspace. Looking up, he saw Sarah Bennett, Emily's